7 children, 1 winter, and a room full of men who decided their fate before Clara Whitmore could even open her mouth. They didn't ask her what she wanted. They didn't ask the children what they feared. They sat behind long wooden desks with files and maps, dividing a family like one divides farmland, cold, calculating, and utterly certain they were right. If you think a mother would just sit idly by and let that happen, stay until the end of this story. Press like to support Clara and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. The cold arrived early that year. By the second week of November, the ground around Raven Creek had frozen so hard that a pickaxe barely scratched it, and the creek itself had gone quiet under a skin of gray ice that thickened a little more each morning. Folks said it was the worst early freeze they'd seen in a decade. Old men who'd spent 40 years on the frontier stood on their porches and looked at the sky and shook their heads and didn't say much, because what was there to say? Winter didn't care about your opinion. Clara Whitmore felt the cold before she even opened her eyes that morning. She lay on her side on the straw mattress she'd shared with Thomas for 11 years, and for a half-second, that brief, merciful half-second between sleep and waking, she forgot he was gone. Then the cold hit her fully, and the silence of the cabin settled around her like a weight, and she remembered. 6 weeks. Thomas had been dead 6 weeks. She sat up slowly. Her breath came out in small clouds. The fire in the hearth had burned down to gray ash sometime in the night, and the cabin was cold enough that she could see the frost on the inside of the window glass. Delicate patterns, almost pretty if you didn't know what they meant. What they meant was that she hadn't kept the fire going. What they meant was that she'd been too exhausted to wake and feed it at midnight the way she was supposed to. What they meant was that 7 children were sleeping in a cabin that had dropped below freezing while their mother lay in bed and dreamed of a man who wasn't coming back. She was on her feet before that thought could finish forming. She crossed to the hearth in 3 steps, knelt on the cold plank floor, and started working, coaxing embers back to life with her breath, feeding in dry kindling from the box beside the fireplace, her fingers stiff and clumsy in the chill. It took longer than it should have. She'd grown up on a farm in Ohio. She knew fire. But her hands didn't seem to remember this morning, and she found herself pressing her forehead against the brick of the hearth and closing her eyes for just a moment, just one moment, to collect herself. "Mama!" She turned. Her daughter Nora stood in the doorway of the sleeping room, wrapped in a quilt that dragged on the floor. She was 9 years old and had Thomas's eyes. Dark brown, steady, watching everything. She watched her mother the way adults watched weather. "Fire went out," Nora said, not accusing, just stating. "I know," Claire said. "It's coming back." Nora padded over without a word and sat cross-legged beside her and held her small hands near the gathering flame. They didn't speak for a minute. The fire caught properly, and the light steadied, and Clara sat back on her heels and looked at her daughter's face in the orange glow. "Is everyone still asleep?" Clara asked. "Henry's awake. He's just pretending." That sounded like Henry. He was 12, the oldest, and since Thomas died, he'd taken on this quality of watchful stillness that Clara didn't quite know what to do with. Like he was waiting for the next bad thing, and had decided the best response was to be very quiet and very ready. "Let him rest," Clara said. She got to her feet and started the morning. It was what she did. You got up, you built the fire, you started the morning. The 7 of them were aged between 3 and 12. Henry was the oldest at 12, then Nora at 9, then the twins, James and Samuel, who had just turned 8 and were more or less indistinguishable in temperament as well as appearance, which caused no end of trouble. Then there was Ruth, who was 6 and sweet-natured and had recently developed a passionate attachment to a particular wooden spoon that she carried everywhere. Then Willie, who was 4 and had decided that the appropriate response to most of life's difficulties was to go boneless on the floor and refuse to move until someone carried him. And then there was the baby, May, who was just past 3 and still nursing sometimes, which Clara knew was probably too old, but which she couldn't bring herself to stop because it was one less crisis to manage, and she was already managing approximately 47 of them. Thomas had died of pneumonia in the first week of October. It had happened fast, faster than Clara had known it could happen. He'd come in from the fields coughing on a Tuesday, and by Friday he was feverish, and by the following Wednesday he was dead. The doctor in Raven Creek had done what he could, which wasn't much. Clara had done what she could, which was also not enough. After the burial, after the neighbors stopped coming around with their casseroles and their awkward condolences and their inability to look directly at her, she'd sat down at the kitchen table with Thomas's account book and tried to understand what they had. What they had was almost nothing. Thomas had been a good man. He had not been a good farmer, and she'd known that when she married him. And she had loved him anyway because he was kind and funny and patient with the children and patient with her. And she had believed that those things would be enough. And maybe they would have been, with a few more years and a few better harvests. But he hadn't gotten those years, and the harvest the last 2 seasons had been thin, and what the account book showed her was a small amount of cash, a debt to Harlan Griggs at the supply store, a cabin that needed a new roof, and a woodpile that was not going to last a full winter. She'd stared at those numbers for a long time. Then she'd closed the book, put it in the drawer, and gone to start supper. The town of Raven Creek had been watching her. She felt it when she went to the store for supplies, the way conversations shifted when she walked in, the way eyes moved to her and then away. People in small frontier towns watched each other the way they watched weather too, not always out of malice, partly out of genuine concern, and partly out of that particular human hunger to know how other people's disasters were unfolding. Clara understood it. She'd been part of it herself at other times, watching other people's troubles with that complicated mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't you. Now it was her. Harlan Griggs had been patient about the debt. He was a stout man in his 60s with a gray beard and small, careful eyes, and he told her there was no rush, just whenever she was able, and she thanked him and meant it. But she saw him talking to Aldous Pryor outside the store one afternoon, and she saw how they both stopped talking when she walked by, and she knew the patience had a limit she couldn't see. Aldous Pryor was the closest thing Raven Creek had to a mayor, though they didn't use that word. He was a land agent who'd been among the first settlers in the valley and had accumulated a certain authority through longevity and force of personality. He was not a bad man, Clara thought, though he was a man who believed very strongly that things should be organized and that disorder was a kind of moral failing. A widow with 7 children and no income was disorder. She could see the way it bothered him when he looked at her. The other name she kept hearing was Reverend Alderman, which was strange because she had no great quarrel with the Reverend. He'd been kind at Thomas's burial, but apparently he'd been having conversations around town about the children, about their welfare, about what the Christian community could do to help. The word help in those conversations seemed to mean something specific that she hadn't been consulted about. She found out what it meant on the 15th of November. The note was delivered by one of the Griggs boys, a teenager who knocked on her door and handed her a folded piece of paper without meeting her eyes and left before she could ask him any questions. She read it standing in the doorway with the cold air coming in around her. Mrs. Whitmore, there will be a community meeting at the hall tomorrow evening regarding the welfare of your children. Your presence is requested. A. Pryor. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and stood there for a moment looking at the frozen yard. Mama? Nora was behind her again. Close the door, Claire said. Keep May away from the fire. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down. She sat there for a long time. She brought Henry with her to the meeting. He was 12, and she didn't think she should take him, but she also didn't want to leave him alone with the younger ones because the twins had recently discovered that the gap under the cabin's floorboards was a good place to hide things, and she worried about what they were hiding. Henry could manage them. And she found she didn't want to walk into that hall alone. He sat beside her in his coat that was getting too short in the sleeves. She kept meaning to let down the hem but hadn't gotten to it. And he didn't fidget. He looked at the men around the room with those watchful eyes and said nothing. There were 14 people in the hall. Most of them were men. Pryor, Griggs, the Reverend, a few of the larger landowners, Doc Finch, who'd tried to save Thomas, and mostly just looked tired all the time. There were also 3 women, Martha Deering, who ran the boarding house, Celia Poss, whose husband owned the mill, and a woman Clara didn't recognize immediately, then placed as Margaret Hoyle, who'd come from back east the previous summer and had apparently already inserted herself into the town's various committees. Aldous Pryor stood when Clara sat down. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this. Clara, he said, and she noticed he didn't use her married name, which she didn't like. We're glad you came. We want you to know that everything said here tonight comes from a place of genuine concern for you and your children. All right, she said. The fact is, winter's here, and we have some worries about your situation. He looked around the room, gathering nods of agreement. The cabin needs work. Your supplies are low. You're alone with 7 children, and it's going to be a hard winter. I know what winter looks like, Clara said. That came out a little sharper than she intended. She saw a couple of the men shift in their seats. Of course you do, Pryor said. He had the practiced smoothness of a man who dealt with difficult people regularly. No one's questioning your capability, Clara. We're talking about the reality of resources. The fact is, one woman alone cannot adequately provide for 7 children through a winter like this one's shaping up to be. The fact is, said Harlan Griggs, less smoothly, the debt at my store is a real thing. Harlan. Pryor looked at him sideways. She knows what I mean. I do know what you mean, Clara said. She kept her voice level. I intend to pay it. I'm looking into work. The Deering house, maybe, or some other arrangement. I need some time. We understand that, the Reverend said. He had a gentle voice and kind eyes, and she had a sudden bad feeling about what that voice and those eyes were about to say. But time is what the winter doesn't give us, and we've been thinking through some arrangements that might help. She looked at him steadily. What kind of arrangements? There was a brief silence. Pryor folded his hands on the table. The Hoyle family has expressed an interest in taking the 2 oldest girls, he said. Nora and... Is it Ruth? Clara heard it the way you hear a sound in the night that you don't immediately understand. Her mind went quiet for a moment. Ruth is 6, she said. That's old enough to help around a house, Margaret Hoyle said. She was a composed woman in her 40s with a straight back and a direct manner. I'm not suggesting she be put to work. I have no children of my own. I'd give her a good home. She has a home, Clara said. Clara, and the 2 oldest girls. She looked around the room. What's the rest of the arrangement? Another silence. Pryor unfolded his hands and folded them again. The Griggs family would take Henry, he said. Put him to work at the store. He'd earn his keep and learn a trade. He's old enough for that, and it would clear the debt. Clara felt Henry go very still beside her. The twins could go to the Fowler ranch, Pryor continued. They're strong boys. Fowler needs hands. They're 8 years old, Clara said. Her voice was very steady. She was working to keep it that way. Boys that age can do useful work on a ranch. And May, she said. Willie, what about them? The Reverend's wife would take the baby, Doc Finch said. He sounded uncomfortable. He looked at the table when he said it. Willie could go to the McAllister family over in Cold Fork. Cold Fork was 20 miles east. Clara looked at the map of this in her mind. Her family scattered across 100 miles of frozen frontier. Henry in a store learning to work off a debt that wasn't his. The twins on some ranch she'd never seen. Ruth in a house with a woman she didn't know. May with the Reverend's wife, who she barely knew. Willie, 20 miles away in Cold Fork, where she would never be able to reach him in the winter. She thought about Willie going boneless on the floor when things got hard. He needed someone who knew him. She thought about May, who still reached for her in the night. She thought about the twins, who fought constantly and were better for it, who understood each other in some way she'd never fully grasped, and what it would mean to separate them. She thought about Henry sitting beside her with his sleeves too short, not saying a word. No, she said. Pryor blinked. Clara, no. She said it again, the same way, the same tone. That's not going to happen. It's not a question of what you want, Griggs said. He was getting impatient. He'd never been a patient man. It's a question of what's practical. You can't keep 7 children alive on nothing. I'm not doing it on nothing. I'm doing it on what I have and what I can earn. Which isn't enough. You don't know what's enough. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't pull it back this time. You've decided it's not enough before you've given me a chance to show you different. Clara. Pryor's voice shifted to something quieter, more careful. We're not your enemies. These families are good people. The children would be cared for. Separately, she said, scattered across the territory where I can't reach them, where they can't reach each other. It's not permanent, just until spring. Children don't know the difference between temporary and permanent, she said. A 3-year-old taken from her mother doesn't understand that spring is coming. She just knows she's alone. The Reverend looked at the table. I understand your pain, Margaret Hoyle said. Truly, but sometimes loving your children means accepting. Ma'am, Clara said, I don't know you. And with respect, you don't have children. So I'll ask you to let me decide what loving my children means. The room went quiet. Henry made a small sound beside her, not quite a word, not quite a laugh. She couldn't look at him, or she'd lose the steadiness she was fighting to hold. Clara, Pryor again, steady, measured. We're going to make this decision with or without your agreement. The welfare of those children. Whose welfare? She turned to look at him fully. Or the town's need to stop worrying about us. Those aren't the same thing, Aldous. Pryor's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, and she could see it. I need 2 weeks, she said. Give me 2 weeks to find another solution. If I can't, then we'll talk again. It's November. Every week you delay. 2 weeks, she said again. Is that too much to ask? 2 weeks before you start pulling my family apart? Silence. Doc Finch cleared his throat. 2 weeks seems reasonable to me. Griggs made a sound of disagreement, but didn't argue the point. Pryor looked around the room. Something passed between him and the other men. Some calculation Clara couldn't quite read. 2 weeks, he said finally. But Clara, you need to find a real solution, not just hope. Winter doesn't wait. I know, she said. She stood, and Henry stood beside her. I've never asked Winter to wait. She didn't cry until they were outside, and then she cried for about 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, standing in the cold dark with her fist pressed against her mouth while Henry stood beside her and looked at the sky. Then she stopped and wiped her face on her sleeve and took a breath that hurt a little from the cold. They're not taking us, Henry said. He wasn't asking. No, she said. They're not. What are we going to do? She looked at the dark outline of the mountains to the north, massive and close in the way mountain ranges get when the air is clear and cold, like they'd moved in overnight. I'm going to think, she said. Come on, let's get home before it freezes. They walked back through the dark. She didn't have answers yet. She had 2 weeks and a problem that felt like a wall, and children sleeping in a cold cabin, and a woodpile that was shrinking, and a debt she couldn't pay, and 14 people who had decided they knew better than she did what her family needed. What she had, though, and she held on to this the way you hold a match in a wind, carefully, with both hands, was the absolute refusal to let them be right. The stars were hard and white above Raven Creek. The cold pressed in from every direction. She walked, and she thought. And she didn't let herself think about May reaching for her in the night, because that was a thought that would undo her, and she couldn't afford to be undone. Not yet. Henry matched his pace to hers without being asked. He didn't say anything else. He was 12 years old, and he understood, in the way that children who've had to grow up fast understand, that some things were better held in silence. The cabin was still warm when they got back. The fire had held. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the sound of her children breathing in the dark. Those small, specific sounds she'd know anywhere, the particular rhythm of each of them. And she thought, I need a miracle, or I need something close enough to one that it doesn't matter. She went inside and built the fire up and sat at the table and started to think. Outside, the temperature dropped another 3 degrees. The mountains to the north were enormous and dark and indifferent, and somewhere beyond them, though Clara didn't know it yet, a man named Elias Crowe was sitting alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands and listening to the same wind and feeling, as he had for years, nothing much about it at all. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and she went through the numbers again, the same numbers she'd been going through for 6 weeks, as if she'd missed something the first dozen times. The cash on hand, the woodpile, the remaining flour and salt pork and dried beans in the cellar, the debt to Griggs, the cost of replacing the 2 boards on the north wall that had warped and let in cold air around the edges. She wrote it all down in the margins of Thomas's account book because there was no other paper handy, and when she was done, she looked at what she'd written, and it told her the same thing it always told her. It wasn't enough, not for 2 weeks, not for a month, Not for a full winter with 7 children and a roof that leaked over the sleeping room when the snow got heavy enough. She closed the book and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. Thomas had built this cabin 8 years ago with help from 2 neighbors who were both gone now. One dead, one moved on west. He'd been proud of it. It wasn't a beautiful cabin, but it was solid, and he'd pointed out the dovetail joints in the corner logs to anyone who'd look, the way men do when they've built something and want it noticed. She'd teased him about it. She missed teasing him. She got up and checked the fire and went to look at the children. The sleeping room held 2 beds and a pile of straw ticking on the floor where the twins slept, which they preferred to the bed because they claimed the bed was too soft, which she suspected was mostly about not being separated even in sleep. May was in the smaller bed with Ruth, curled around each other. Willie had migrated, as he always did, from his spot near the twins to the foot of the big bed where Henry and Nora slept, wedged in at their feet like a small, determined dog. Henry was on his back with his arm over his eyes. Nora was on her side facing the wall. Clara stood in the doorway long enough that the cold from the hall started coming through her socks. "They're not taking you," she thought at them. "I don't know how yet, but they're not." She went back to the table and started a different kind of list. Not numbers this time, names, people she could ask for work, things she could sell, though there wasn't much. Her mother's silver hairbrush, maybe, if it came to that. Whether there was any possibility of a loan from someone who wasn't Griggs. Whether the Deering boarding house might need a laundress or a cook, and what that would pay, and whether she could do it while still being home enough to keep the younger children from burning the cabin down. She was still sitting there when the gray light started coming through the window. The next 5 days were a particular kind of desperate that she didn't show to anyone. She went to see Martha Deering about work at the boarding house. Martha was a practical woman who'd been widowed herself years back, and she didn't offer false comfort, which Clara appreciated. But she also said what was true. She had a girl already, a niece who'd come in from the east, and she couldn't afford to pay another wage. She might have scrubbing work in the spring. Clara thanked her and left. She went to the mill and spoke to Amos Poss, who was polite and unhelpful. She went to a woman named Edna Carr, who'd once mentioned needing help with her sewing, but Edna's eyesight had gotten bad and she wasn't taking on work anymore, let alone paying anyone else to do it. She asked at the schoolhouse whether they needed any help, cleaning, repairs, anything, and was told there was no budget for it. On the 4th day, walking back from another conversation that had led nowhere, she passed the notice board outside the post office and stopped. There was a paper tacked to it that she'd seen before but hadn't paid attention to because it hadn't been relevant. It was a notice from a man named Elias Crowe, posted several weeks back saying he had elk hides for trade and was looking for someone to take them on commission to Dalton, the larger town 40 miles south. He'd left a contact method through the post office. She stood and read it twice. She knew the name Elias Crowe the way everyone in Raven Creek knew it, by reputation rather than encounter. He was a mountain man, a trapper and hunter, lived somewhere north of the ridge in a place most people hadn't been and didn't care to go. He came into town maybe 3 or 4 times a year for supplies and traded hides and left without lingering. She'd seen him once from a distance and registered him as large and dark-bearded and not particularly interested in being looked at. The stories about him were the kind that accumulate around solitary men on the frontier. That he'd killed a man once, though no one could agree on the circumstances. That he'd lost a wife years back, though no one seemed certain of that either. That he was strange or dangerous or just deeply antisocial, depending on who you asked. Doc Finch had patched him up after a trapping accident 2 winters ago and said he was quiet but not unkind. Harlan Griggs said he didn't trust a man who didn't want neighbors. Most people just said he kept to himself and left it at that. Clara looked at the notice for a long moment. Then she went inside the post office and asked about him. The postmaster, a thin, nervous man named Cobb, told her that Crowe came in occasionally and that he could pass along a message, but that he couldn't promise when it would reach him. Could be days, could be a week or more, depending on when he came to town. She didn't have a week. She had 10 days now. She thanked Cobb and walked home and kept thinking. It was Nora who heard about the meeting. Clara had told Henry what happened in the hall, had felt he deserved to know, but she hadn't told the others. Nora had ears like a cat, though. She heard things. She was sitting at the table doing her figuring when Clara came in from another fruitless afternoon, and she looked up and said, without preamble, "The Hoyle woman wants to take me and Ruth." Clara stopped in the doorway. "Where did you hear that?" "Emma Griggs told me at the well." Nora's voice was flat. "She said her papa said you'd agreed." "I didn't agree to anything." Nora nodded, like this confirmed something she'd already decided. "What are we going to do?" "I'm working on it." "Are we going to have to leave?" "No." Nora looked at her for a moment with those steady brown eyes. "Okay," she said, and went back to her figuring. Clara stood there for a second, something complicated happening in her chest. She wanted to ask how Nora could just accept that answer. She also knew Nora was 9 years old, and she had nowhere else to put her trust. She had to trust her mother. There was no alternative. That was its own kind of weight to carry. James and Samuel were fighting in the corner about something that appeared to involve a piece of string. Ruth was trying to feed the wooden spoon to May, who was refusing. Willie had appeared from somewhere and was pulling on Clara's coat. "Mama, Mama, Mama!" "What, Willie?" "I can't find my other sock." "It's probably under the bed." "I looked under the bed." "Look again." He disappeared. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg and started on supper, working through what she knew and what she needed and how many days were left, the numbers running in the back of her mind like water under ice. The knock at her door came on the 7th day, early morning, before the children were properly awake. She opened it and found herself looking at a man she recognized after a half-second. Large, dark-bearded, a coat that had seen a lot of weather. He had a hat pulled down against the cold, and he held it in his hand when she opened the door, which was the first thing she noticed because it was such an automatic, old-fashioned courtesy that it surprised her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm Elias Crowe." She'd figured that out already. "How did you know where I live?" "Cobb at the post office. He said you'd been asking after me." He paused. "I didn't see a message, so I thought I'd come by instead of waiting." "I was asking about your hides commission." "I know." He looked at her steadily. He wasn't, she noticed, the kind of man who talked to fill silence. "Cobb also told me some other things." She waited. He shifted his weight slightly. "He told me about the meeting Pryor called, about your situation." She felt a quick flash of irritation, at Cobb, at the smallness of small towns, at the way everyone knew your business before you decided what to do with it. "That's between me and the town," she said. "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not pity, which she would have shut the door on, but something harder to name. "I heard what they're planning to do with your children. I'm handling it." "Are you?" It wasn't a challenge exactly. It was more like a genuine question asked by someone who wanted to know the actual answer. She looked at him. He was maybe 40, maybe a little older, with the kind of face that spends a lot of time outdoors and shows it. His eyes were gray, or maybe dark blue, hard to tell in the early morning light. "I haven't figured it out completely yet," she said, which was more honest than she'd intended to be. He nodded. "I want to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" He looked past her into the cabin for just a moment. She stepped slightly to block his view, a reflex, then back at her. "My place is north of the ridge, about 4 hours by wagon on a good road, more if the weather's bad. I've got a cabin. It's not large, but it's solid. I built it to last. I've got a full woodpile, a good well, and enough stored food to run a winter without trouble." He paused. "I'm offering to take you and your children there until spring." The silence lasted several seconds. "Why?" she said. He seemed to expect the question. "Because what they're planning to do is wrong," he said. "Splitting up a family to solve a town's inconvenience, that's not right." "You don't know me." "No." "You've never spoken to me before today." "That's true." She studied him. "People talk about you," she said. "They say you're not—" She stopped, reconsidered the phrasing. "They say you don't like people much." Something shifted in his expression, almost humor, not quite. "That's accurate. So why are you standing at my door offering to take in a woman and 7 children?" He looked at her directly and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've been asked to explain myself more times than I can count for things I don't do. I'm not used to being asked to explain why I'm trying to help." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." He turned his hat in his hands once, a slow rotation. "My mother had 6 children and not enough to get through the winter once. Nobody offered her anything except a lecture about her husband's poor planning." He stopped. "That's the closest thing to an explanation I've got." Clara looked at him for a long moment. He was a stranger. He was a man people didn't trust. And she didn't know how much of that was deserved and how much was just the particular suspicion that accumulates around solitary people. She had 7 children, one of whom was barely past being a baby, and one of whom cried when strangers looked at him wrong. She had 10 days, now 9. She had an offer from a man who'd known her for approximately 4 minutes. "I need to think about it," she said. "That's fair? Where will you be?" "Griggs's store to pick up an order. Then I was going to make camp on the creek road tonight and head back tomorrow morning." He put his hat back on. "If you want to talk more, I'll be at the store till midday." He left without waiting for her to say anything else, which she also noticed. He didn't linger, didn't push, didn't give her the look that men sometimes gave her, that measuring look that made her feel like she owed them something just for talking to her. He walked back to the road and didn't turn around. Clara stood in the open doorway until she couldn't see him anymore. Behind her, Willie said, "Mama, who was that man?" "Someone from the mountains." "Why was he here?" "He made an offer." "What kind of offer?" "Go find your sock," she said. She went to find Henry. He was in the woodshed splitting kindling, which he'd started doing on his own a few weeks back without being asked, which made her proud and broke her heart a little at the same time. She stood in the doorway and told him what had happened. All of it. The offer, the details, the man. Henry set down the axe. He was 12, and sometimes he looked 12, and sometimes he looked like someone trying to figure out how to carry something too heavy for his frame. This was one of the second times. "You think he means it?" Henry said. "I don't know. I think he wasn't lying. That's not quite the same thing." "You think it's safe?" "I don't know that either." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know what you think." Henry picked up the axe again, just to have something to do with his hands. He turned it over and set it down again. "The town's other plan is worse," he said finally. "That's true. At least with him we'd be together." "That's what I keep coming back to," she said. Henry was quiet for another moment. "What if he's—" He stopped, tried again. "What if we get up there and it's bad?" "Then we leave," she said. "We'd still be together. We could still leave." He didn't say anything. "I'm not going to tell you I'm certain," she said. "I'm not, but I think staying here, the way things are, that road only goes one place." He picked up the axe for real this time and split a piece of kindling, clean down the middle. Then another. She waited. "Go talk to him," he said. "At the store. See if you can get a better read on him." She walked into town. Griggs's store was not crowded at mid-morning, which was either luck or not. Depending on how you looked at it, there were fewer ears to carry things back, but also no cover. She found Elias Crowe at the back counter, picking up a list of supplies, talking to Griggs's wife in the terse, minimal way he apparently talked to everyone. He saw Clara come in and nodded, and Griggs's wife looked between them with visible curiosity. Clara waited until he'd settled his order and moved away from the counter. "You said a cabin," she said without greeting. "How many rooms?" He seemed unfazed by the directness. "One main room, one smaller room in the back. Added it 2 years ago. Good fireplace in the main room, smaller stove in the back." 9 people, she said. "That's going to be a problem." "It'll be tight," he said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise." "What are we supposed to do for space? For everything that comes with 9 people living in a small cabin?" "I'll sleep in the barn," he said. "With winter, it won't be comfortable, but it won't kill me. That gives you and the children the cabin." She hadn't expected that. She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" she said. "It's your home." "Yes," he said simply. She tried a different angle. What do you want out of this? There has to be something. He looked at her with a steadiness that was starting to feel less like coldness and more like just the way he was. Help around the place when it's possible. I'll need someone to keep the fire going, tend the stores, handle the daily work. I can't do all of that and hunt at the same time. You'd be earning your keep. He paused. That's all I want. And in the spring, you leave, he said, or you don't. That's your choice to make, not mine. Griggs's wife had found reasons to dust shelves nearby. Clara glanced at her, then back at Crowe. If I say yes, she said, we'd need to leave in 2 days, before Pryor comes back to me. I'll have the wagon ready. She looked at this man, this stranger with his weathered face and his direct gray eyes and his cabin 4 hours into the mountains. She thought about May, who reached for her in the night. She thought about Henry, who'd said at least with him we'd be together. She thought about the hall full of men with their maps and their arrangements, carving her family up like something to be distributed. She thought, I don't know him. I don't trust him. I don't know if this is a terrible decision or the only possible one. 2 days, she said. We'll be ready. Telling the children was harder than she thought it would be. Ruth cried, because Ruth cried at most things. And Willie cried because Ruth cried. And May didn't understand enough to cry, but kept asking where they were going in the particular relentless way of 3-year-olds. The twins took it as an adventure, which was a relief, though she knew their enthusiasm would outlast their patience by approximately 1 day. Nora listened to the whole explanation without expression and then said, Will we come back? Probably in the spring, Clara said. Probably, Nora repeated. I'm being honest with you. Nora looked at her for a moment. Okay, she said again, that same word that meant I have decided to trust you even though I'm not sure. Henry said nothing at all, but the next morning he was up before dawn loading what they had into crates. She went to Pryor's house the morning they left. She knocked on his door at 7 a.m, which she knew he'd find rude, and she told him, straight and brief, that she had made other arrangements and that the meeting's proposals were no longer necessary and that she was leaving Raven Creek for the winter. He stood in his doorway in his coat, looking at her with the expression of a man whose plan has been disrupted. What arrangements? He said. Private ones. Clara, you can't just... We were trying to help. I know you were, she said. I know some of you were, anyway. She looked at him evenly. I'm keeping my family together. That's what I'm doing. If it works out, you'll see us in the spring. She left before he could say anything more. She heard him call her name once behind her, but she didn't turn around. The wagon was waiting on the creek road, Elias Crowe on the seat, the horse stamping against the cold. Her 7 children were bundled into the back with every blanket she owned and the crates of what she'd been able to pack. Henry was in the back with them. Nora had May in her lap. Clara climbed up onto the seat. Ready? Crowe said. She looked back at Raven Creek, the hall where 14 people had decided what to do with her children, the store with its debt, the cabin she'd lived in for 8 years and had to leave because she couldn't keep it warm. She thought about Thomas and the dovetail joints in the corner logs and how proud he'd been of this ordinary life he'd built. She looked north, at the ridge, at the mountains that were enormous and indifferent and full of things she didn't know yet. Yes, she said. He clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved. Behind her, Willie said something to James, who elbowed Samuel, who said something back. May was making a sound that wasn't quite singing. Ruth held her wooden spoon. Nora watched the road ahead. Henry sat very straight with his arms around the smaller ones and his jaw set in a way that looked, from the back, almost exactly like his father. The road went north into the cold, into the mountains, into the unknown. Clara watched the ridge get closer and held onto the seat as the wagon hit a rut in the frozen road, and she thought, this is either the best decision I've ever made or a catastrophic one, and the only way to find out is to keep going. She kept going. The cabin was smaller than she'd imagined. She'd prepared herself during the 4-hour wagon ride, told herself it would be rough. That rough was fine. That rough was survivable. But when the wagon came around the last bend in the trail and she saw it, a low-roofed structure of dark logs set against the mountain like it had grown out of the rock, her first honest thought was, 9 people cannot live in that. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop, and set the brake without comment. The children were quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Clara noticed it. Even the twins were still. May had fallen asleep against Nora's shoulder during the last hour of the ride, and Nora sat looking at the cabin with the particular expression she got when she was thinking hard about something and had decided not to say it yet. Henry climbed down first. He stood in the snow and looked at the cabin and then at Elias and said, "How old is it?" 11 years, Elias said, give or take. You build it yourself? Mostly. Henry nodded slowly, like he was taking inventory. Then he turned and started lifting crates out of the wagon without being asked, which was so like Thomas in that moment that Clara had to look away. "Come on," she said to the others. "Let's go inside and see what we have." So, what they had was one main room that held a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves along one wall stocked with enough provisions to make Clara's chest loosen a little when she saw them, and a floor of packed earth covered partly by a heavy woven rug that had seen better years. The back room was smaller, barely large enough for 2 people, with a cot and a small iron stove and a single window that faced north. The ceiling was low, the walls were solid, the fireplace drew well. It wasn't what she'd had. It was far better than what she'd been about to lose. Willie walked in, looked around very seriously, and said, "Where's the other room?" "This is it," Clara said. He turned a full circle, taking it in. "All of us live here?" "All of us live here." He thought about this. "Where does the big man sleep?" "In the barn." Willie processed this. "Why does he sleep in the barn?" "Because he's being kind. Barns are cold." "I know. That's not very good for him." "No," Clara said. "It's not." She caught Elias in the doorway behind her, and he had the look of a man pretending he hadn't heard any of that. The first week was hard in ways she'd expected, and hard in ways she hadn't. The space was the first thing. 9 people in a single main room, even with the children sleeping in the back with the small stove going, even with Elias in the barn, was a constant negotiation of bodies and noise and needs. Ruth cried every morning for the first 4 days, a low, persistent crying that she couldn't or wouldn't explain, just sat at the table with her wooden spoon and cried until she stopped. May got into Elias's provision shelves on the second day and pulled out a sack of dried beans that spilled across the entire floor. The twins discovered that the space under the cabin's one interior step was a perfect hiding spot and began a covert operation to store objects there, which Clara only discovered when a smell led her to the discovery of 3 strips of salt pork they'd squirreled away against some perceived future shortage. Henry was the one who kept her sane those first days. He worked without complaint. He carried water from the well, chopped wood, helped Clara figure out the system of the kitchen, which pots Elias used for what, where the good cutting knife was, how the smoke backed up if you let the fire get too low. He didn't talk much. He and Elias moved around each other in the careful way of 2 people who haven't worked out their terms yet, neither hostile nor comfortable. Elias himself was a problem she hadn't fully calculated. He was in the cabin during the days more than she'd expected. He had things to do, equipment to maintain, repairs to make before the deep cold settled in. He worked quietly and didn't get in the way, and asked for nothing beyond the basic courtesies. But the children reacted to him in ways that required management. May had decided he was interesting and followed him around with the fixed attention she usually reserved for insects she was about to poke. Willie hid behind Clara whenever he came inside. Ruth had nothing to say to him, but had started watching him in a sideways manner that Clara recognized as the beginning of a verdict being formed. The twins treated him like a feature of the landscape, present, noted, not yet categorized. James, the louder twin, made the first direct contact. He walked up to Elias one afternoon while Elias was sharpening a knife at the table and said, with no preamble, "Can you track a wolf?" Elias looked up from the knife. "Yes." "Have you ever done it?" "Several times." "Did you kill it?" "Sometimes." James thought about this. "What happens if you don't kill it?" "It goes back to wherever it came from," Elias said, "and you go back to wherever you came from." James accepted this and walked away. 5 minutes later, he was back with Samuel, who appeared to have the same set of questions. Nora was the one who surprised her most. Nora, who had always been the one who watched and waited and formed her opinion slowly and privately, Nora made her judgment in about 4 days, and Clara only found out what it was because she overheard a conversation she hadn't meant to. She was coming in from the well when she heard Nora's voice through the cabin wall, coming from around the side where Elias had built a small lean-to for storing equipment. "You don't talk much," Nora was saying. "No," Elias said. "Henry doesn't either, since our father died." A pause. "When did he die?" "October. It was fast." Another pause. "Do you think it's better when it's fast? Or is it worse because you don't have time to say things?" Clara stopped walking and stood very still in the snow. She heard Elias say, "I think both things are true at the same time." Nora was quiet for a moment. "That's what I think too," she said. Clara walked around to the front door and went inside and stood next to the fire for a minute before she could look like herself again. Henry's anger surfaced on the 9th day. She hadn't seen it coming, which was her fault. She'd been watching for it, and then the daily crush of managing 7 children and learning a new space and keeping everyone fed had taken her attention, and she'd missed the pressure building. It started with something small. Elias correcting Henry on the way he was stacking the wood pile. Not harshly, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly. The wood went bark side down so the moisture drained out, not the way Henry had been doing it. It was a reasonable thing to say. Henry knew it was reasonable, but he put down the log he was holding very carefully, with a controlled precision that Clara recognized from Thomas when Thomas was trying very hard not to say something he'd regret. And she looked up from where she was working and saw it and thought, "Here it comes." "I've been stacking wood for 2 years," Henry said. "I know how to stack wood." "You were doing it the wrong way," Elias said. He wasn't unkind, he was just direct. "My father showed me how." "Your father may have had a different setup." Elias kept his voice even. "Water gets into bark-up stacks in heavy snow, rots the bottom of the pile." "My father knew what he was doing." "I didn't say he didn't." Henry turned around. His face was very still and very tight, and he was 12 years old, and he was furious in the way people get furious when they've been holding something together so long that the smallest pressure finds the crack. "You don't know anything about my father," he said. Elias looked at him without flinching. "You're right," he said. "I don't. We didn't ask to be here. I know that. We don't need you to fix everything." Henry's voice cracked slightly on the last word, which seemed to make him angrier. "We were doing fine." The cabin was very quiet. Clara had stopped moving. The twins had frozen in place near the far wall. Nora was watching from the back doorway. Elias set down the log he was holding. He looked at Henry for a moment with an expression that Clara couldn't quite read, and then he said, "You're right that you don't need me to fix everything. You've been carrying a lot of weight for a long time, and you've done it well." He paused. "Bark goes down. That's just the wood, not a judgment about anything else." Henry stood there. Elias picked the log back up and went back to work. Henry stood for another moment, and Clara could see the anger working through him, looking for somewhere to go and not quite finding the right target anymore. He picked up a log. He turned it over. He placed it bark side down. He didn't say anything else. Neither did Elias. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding and went back to stirring the pot. Later that night, after the younger ones were asleep and Elias had gone to the barn, she found Henry sitting at the table in the firelight. She sat across from him and didn't say anything for a minute. "I know," he said finally. "I didn't say anything. I was rude to him." "You were hurting," she said. "There's a difference. But yes, you were rude." Henry looked at the fire. He comes in and starts telling us how to do everything. He knows how to survive up here," Clara said. "We don't yet. It doesn't mean he has to." Henry stopped, tried again. "It feels like he's trying to replace something." "He's not," Clara said. "He's just a man who knows how to stack wood in the mountains." Henry was quiet for a long time. "I miss Papa," he said, very quietly, like he hadn't meant to say it. "I know," she said. "I do too. Every day." She put her hand over his on the table, and they sat there for a while, and the fire burned, and outside the wind moved through the pines with that particular mountain sound, low and sustained, like something breathing. Now, By the second week, the children were learning the mountain in the way children learn things when they're actually interested, fast, and with total commitment. Elias had started teaching them, which she wasn't sure was intentional. It seemed to happen the way things happen with children. They asked questions, and he answered them, and the answers led to demonstrations, and the demonstrations led to lessons that nobody had officially declared lessons. He showed the twins how to read snow, how the texture and depth told you about recent temperature shifts, how to find the paths animals made when they were moving through in the dark. He showed Henry how to check the tension on a snare and why it mattered, how to read a tree's lean for where the wind came from most. He sat with Nora one afternoon and showed her how to use a compass, and she learned it in about 20 minutes, and then asked him 8 follow-up questions that he answered with the same patient directness he applied to everything. Ruth was the hardest one. She was 6 and small, and she'd been upset since they left Raven Creek in a quiet, persistent way that Clara couldn't fully reach. She talked less than usual. She carried her wooden spoon everywhere. She watched Elias from a careful distance. One morning, toward the end of the second week, Clara was in the back room with May and heard Ruth's voice in the main room. "What's that?" Ruth said. "A hatchet," Elias said. "What do you use it for?" "Splitting small wood, kindling." A pause. "Can I try?" "It's sharp and it's heavy. You'd need to be careful." "I'm careful," Ruth said with considerable dignity. Clara peeked through the doorway. Elias was kneeling on the floor next to Ruth, showing her how to hold the small hatchet with both hands, steady, controlled. Ruth's face was completely concentrated, the way it got when she was serious about something. She raised it and brought it down on the piece of kindling wood he'd set up, and it split, not perfectly but adequately, and she looked up at him with an expression that was startled and pleased, and trying not to show too much of either. "Not bad," Elias said. "Can I do another one?" "One more," he said. "Then you have to let it rest." "Tools need to rest. Good ones do," he said. Ruth did the second piece. She stood up very straight and handed the hatchet back to him. "I'll do it again tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. She walked away with her wooden spoon. Elias watched her go with an expression that Clara caught for just a second before he looked away. Something careful and unguarded, like a man who has forgotten for a moment to keep his face in order. She went back to May before he could see her watching. She started to see small things about him that added up to something she couldn't quite name yet. He never took the chair closest to the fire, always left it for her or the older children. He repaired things without mentioning it. The latch on the back door that had been sticking, a gap in the chinking on the north wall that he must have noticed was letting in cold, the loose board on the step under which the twins kept their stores, which he fixed, and then apparently pretended not to know what had been under there. He had a book, a battered, spine-broken copy of something she couldn't see the title of, that he read by firelight some evenings before going to the barn, and he always put it away when anyone came near, with the speed of a man hiding something private. She asked him about it one evening when the children were all asleep. "What do you read?" she said. He looked at the book, then at her. "Poetry," he said. She hadn't expected that. "Poetry? Is that strange?" "For a man who lives alone in the mountains, a little." He was quiet for a moment. "A woman I knew used to read it to me," he said. He said it simply, without drama, but with the particular flatness of someone removing feeling from a sentence so that they can say it at all. Clara looked at him. She'd heard the rumors about a lost wife. She hadn't asked about it, and she didn't ask now because his face had closed the door and she wasn't going to put her foot in it. But something shifted in her understanding of him. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, like a picture hanging slightly crooked that someone has straightened. "Thank you for the fire," she said instead. "Every morning. I know you're building it up before you go to the barn." He looked mildly surprised, like he'd thought she hadn't noticed. "You're up early enough," he said, so are you." He looked at the fire for a moment. "Old habit," he said. She nodded and went to check on May, and the conversation ended, but she turned it over for a while afterward. The poetry, the woman, the old habit of building a fire before anyone else was awake. A man who had once had someone to build a fire for, and had kept doing it anyway after she was gone. What? The hunt became necessary in the 4th week. She didn't need him to explain it to her. She could see the inventory herself. She'd been tracking it since the 1st week, the way she tracked everything, running numbers in the back of her mind. The stores were adequate but not abundant, with 9 people eating through the winter and a stretch of deep cold ahead that would keep everyone inside and burning through food faster than they moved in good weather. They needed more meat. Elias told her the morning he was going. He came in from the barn. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. 2 days if the hunting is good. 3 if it's not." He paused. "Maybe longer if the weather turns." She looked at him. "What does the weather look like?" "Today and tonight. After that, I'm not certain." She nodded. She wanted to ask him what to do if he didn't come back, but she didn't ask it because asking it would make it real, and also because she already knew. She'd do what she'd been doing. She'd manage. "The well," she said. "If it freezes before you're back?" "There's an ice pick hanging by the barn door. Break it at the middle. The ice is thinner there at this time of year." "The west wallboard. If the wind kicks up hard from the northwest, stack the extra blankets against the interior of that wall. It's the weak spot." She nodded again. He told her 3 more things, practical and specific, the way he told her everything. No embellishment, no reassurance, just information. "All right," she said. He went. She watched the wagon. He was taking the horse for the lower trail, then going on foot from there, until it disappeared into the trees, and then she went inside and put the water on to boil, and told the children that Elias had gone hunting and they were in charge of keeping everything running. "For how long?" Nora asked. "Until he comes back." Nora absorbed this. "What if something happens?" "We handle it," Clara said, "the way we always have." He had been gone for almost 3 days when the storm came in. She'd been watching the sky get heavy since the previous afternoon. The particular flat gray of serious mountain weather, the wind shifting direction twice in one morning, the smell of the air changing in a way she was just beginning to learn to read. She got everyone inside and built the fire up, and stacked blankets against the west wall, and moved the stores away from the north side of the room, and told the twins to stop asking about it. The snow started in the late afternoon and didn't stop. By nightfall, it was heavy, and the wind was coming in gusts that shook the cabin walls with enough force to wake May, who didn't cry but pressed herself against Clara and breathed fast. Clara held her and looked at the fire and thought about Elias in the high country in this. She thought, he's been up there alone for years. He knows what he's doing. She thought, people die in storms like this regardless. She didn't say either of those things out loud. On the second day of the storm, Henry came to her with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Worried in a specific, directed way, not the general watchful worry he'd carried since October. "He's been gone 3 days," he said. "I know." That's what he said was the outside. "I know that too." "What do we do if We can't go out in this," she said, "and neither could he. He'll have found shelter." Henry looked at her the way Nora sometimes did, checking the gap between what she was saying and what she actually believed. "I think he'll come back," she said. "I don't know that, but I think it." Henry nodded. He went back to his tasks without another word. The storm blew for another full day and then broke sometime in the night. And when Clara opened the cabin door in the gray early morning, the world was buried and white and very still. She stood in the doorway and looked at the trail that led down into the trees, and there was nothing on it. She made breakfast. She kept the fire going. She told herself, 1 hour at a time. It was the middle of the morning when Samuel, who had appointed himself watch at the front window, said, "Someone's coming." She crossed to the window in 4 steps. There was a figure on the trail, moving slowly and wrong, not the steady, deliberate pace she'd come to recognize. Lurching slightly, stopping, moving again. She was out the door before she decided to go. She went down the trail in the snow at a half run, and as she got closer, she could see that Elias was carrying something across his shoulders, a dressed hindquarter wrapped in hide, and that he was moving the way people move when they're running on the last of everything. His face when she reached him was pale underneath the beard, and there was blood on his jacket that was not from the elk, and he stopped when she reached him and looked at her with an expression of pure exhausted relief that he didn't bother to hide. "Lion," he said, by way of explanation. "High shelf. Got me on the left side." "How bad?" "I've had worse." He said it with a flatness that made her think he was not lying, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd been trying to reassure her. "I need to sit down." "You need to get inside," she said. "The elk. Henry will get the elk." She turned and called back toward the cabin, where Henry and Nora were already coming down the trail toward them. "Henry, take this from him." She got under Elias's right arm and took his weight, and they went up to the cabin, and she could feel through her shoulder how much of an effort each step was costing him. He made it inside. He sat in the chair by the fire, the good chair, the one she'd thought of as hers, and she knelt down and started opening his jacket, and the wound when she saw it was bad enough that she sat back on her heels for a moment and made herself look at it without flinching before she decided what to do. 3 long gashes across the left ribs, deep in the middle one, already hot to the touch, even through all that cold. He'd packed it with something, moss or lichen, she couldn't be sure, but it was seeping. 3 days, she said. "You've been moving on this for 3 days." "Had to get back," he said. "You could have sheltered longer." "I said I'd come back in 3 days." She looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, with the slightly unfocused look of someone working very hard to stay present. "You came back because you said you would," she said. "Yes." She sat with that for a second, then she got up and went for her kit. What she had was not much: good thread, needles, clean cloths, the bottle of whiskey she'd packed on the chance that its medical uses would outweigh its other ones. She'd stitched cuts before, on herself once, on Henry when he was 9 and got his hand caught on a wire fence, but nothing like this. The middle gash was going to need real attention, and the heat already coming off it told her she was working against time she didn't have enough of. The children were ranged around the far side of the room, quiet, in the way children get when they understand that something serious is happening, and the best thing they can do is not add to it. Even Willie was still. "Nora," Clara said, "keep May in the back room. Willie, go with them." "I want to," Willie started. "Willie." She looked at him. He went. "Henry," Elias said. His voice was steady, which she suspected cost him something. "The quarter I brought in. It needs to be hung in the cold. Barn, north wall hook. You understand?" "Yes," Henry said. "Before it warms." "I understand." Henry was already moving. Clara poured whiskey and looked at Elias. "This is going to be bad," she said. "I know. You should lie down. Chair's fine." "You're going to want to be lying down," she said. He looked at her and understood what she meant and nodded and let her help him to the floor with his back against the wall and a folded blanket behind him. His hands were steady, which told her something about the man. She'd seen grown men come apart over lesser wounds. She worked carefully and tried not to let her own hands shake. He didn't make much noise, which somehow made it harder, not easier. Once she heard him pull in a sharp breath and hold it, and she stopped and looked at his face and said, "Say something if you need me to stop." "Keep going," he said. She kept going. When it was done, she sat back and looked at what she'd managed. It was not a doctor's work, but it was the best she had, and she'd been thorough and careful, and she thought it would hold. The infection was the real danger now. The heat she could already feel coming off him, the way his eyes had gone slightly glassy. She built the fire higher. She made broth from what she had and made him drink it. She sent Nora to get the extra blankets and James to get snow for cooling and told Samuel to keep the fire going and not to let it drop below a certain point that she showed him. And then she began the long watch, the thing there was nothing to do about except do it. Sitting through the night and the night after, checking the wound, bringing the fever down when it spiked, fighting for him the way he'd climbed down a mountain with 3 claw wounds because he'd said he would be back in 3 days. By the second night, the fever was at its worst. He was not fully conscious, or not consistently. He came in and out, sometimes looking at her with recognition, and sometimes saying things that made no sense, fragments of sentences she couldn't assemble into meaning. Once he said a name, a woman's name. Eleanor said it twice in a low, rough voice, and then went quiet again. She didn't ask about it. She wrung out the cloth and pressed it to his forehead and kept watch. On the 3rd morning, he opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at her. She was sitting against the wall beside him, a blanket over her shoulders, the fire low and in need of tending, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the trail, that unguarded, exhausted relief. And he said, "You stayed." "Yes," she said. "You should have slept." "Nora took the early hours," she said. "I slept." "Nora," he repeated, like he was placing it. He closed his eyes and opened them again. "How long?" 3 days. He absorbed this. The fever broke. "This morning." He tried to push himself up and she put her hand on his shoulder. "Not yet," she said. He settled back. "The stores." "The twins have been managing the firewood. Henry rationed the food. It's fine." She looked at him. "Everything is fine. You just have to stay still and let this close properly." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working through something. "You saved the elk," she said. "You came back through a storm with 3 claw wounds and a fever coming on because you'd said 3 days. So the least you can do now is lie there and let me help you." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. Outside, she could hear the twins arguing about something, which was such a normal sound that she almost laughed. Henry's voice cut across the argument, saying something firm that ended it. May was making her not quite singing sound from the back room. Elias lay still and listened to all of it, and Clara watched his face, and something about the way he listened, like a man hearing music after a long time in silence, told her more about him than anything he'd said in 4 weeks. She went to build the fire up. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't need him to, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the fire grew, and outside the mountain sat under its winter weight, enormous and cold and utterly indifferent, and in the cabin that was too small for 9 people, everyone was alive and everyone was together, and for now that was enough. He healed slowly, which she suspected was not his natural preference. On the 2nd day of his recovery, he tried to get up and do something useful, and she found him standing in the middle of the main room with his hand braced against the table and his jaw set in a way that she'd come to recognize as the expression he wore when he was trying to will his body into compliance through sheer stubbornness. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The snares on the north line need checking," he said. "Henry checked them this morning." A pause. "The horse needs— James and Samuel have been managing the barn. The horse is fine." She pulled out a chair. "Sit down." "I'm not an invalid." "You were delirious 3 days ago," she said. "Sit down." He sat, with the reluctant care of a man whose body had temporarily gained the upper hand over his intentions. She put broth in front of him and he drank it without argument, which told her he was still weaker than he was showing. "You don't have to hover," he said. "I'm not hovering. I'm standing in my kitchen making dinner." "It's my kitchen." "You gave it to me for the winter," she said. "Sit down and drink your broth." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He drank the broth. Yeah. The children had changed during the 3 days of his fever. She noticed it incrementally, the way you notice growth in children. You look away and look back, and something is different, but you can't pinpoint exactly when the shift happened. Henry was the most visible. He had taken over the daily operations of the cabin with a seriousness and a competence that she watched with complicated feelings, pride and gratitude. And underneath both of those, the quiet ache of watching a boy have to become something older than he should need to be. He'd organized the twins into a wood-carrying rotation without being asked. He'd rationed the stores carefully and kept a rough accounting on a piece of bark with a charcoal stick, the way she'd have done it. He'd managed Willie's crying on the 2nd night. Willie had woken from a bad dream and found Clara dozing beside Elias and gotten frightened, and Henry had taken him to the back room and sat with him and talked him down, and she only knew about it because Nora told her the next morning. She told Henry this 2 days into Elias's recovery, when they were outside together splitting kindling in the cold morning air. "Nora told you," Henry said. He didn't look up from the wood. "She did." Willie was scared. He split a piece, set up another. "Somebody had to." "You did more than that," Clara said. "You kept everything running." Henry split another piece. "Mr. Crowe told me what to do before he went hunting. The snares, the barn, the wood rotation." He paused. "He told me like he thought I could handle it." She looked at her son's profile, the set of his jaw, the way he worked with that careful, deliberate force. "You could," she said, "and you did." He nodded, just once. He didn't say anything else, but she saw his shoulders drop a fraction, the way they did when he let something go. Whoa. Elias was out of bed and moving carefully around the cabin by the end of the first week, and by the second week he was doing limited work outside. And by the third week she had to stop watching him so closely because it was making her anxious in a way she didn't have words for yet. What she noticed, when she let herself notice it, was that the cabin had reorganized itself around 9 people in a way that felt less like crisis and more like, she didn't have the right word. Pattern, maybe. Habit. The particular texture of daily life that builds up when people stop being strangers and start just being people who share space. Elias had moved back to the barn once he was well enough, as he'd said he would. But he ate with them now, at the crowded table where the children jostled for position and someone spilled something at nearly every meal, and the noise level was such that she sometimes had to raise her voice to be heard. He sat at the end of the table with his bowl and ate without complaint, and sometimes he talked and sometimes he didn't, and the children had stopped treating him like a feature of the landscape and started treating him like a person, which was its own kind of adjustment. May called him Lias, which she'd arrived at on her own and which no one corrected because it seemed to suit both of them. She had completed her assessment of him weeks ago and found him acceptable, and she communicated this primarily by sitting next to him at meals and occasionally leaning against his arm. He bore this with a stillness that Clara suspected was more deliberate than it looked. Willie remained the most cautious, but Willie was cautious about most things. He watched from a careful distance and contributed small observations from time to time. "Your beard is very big," he told Elias one morning, with the frank concern of a 4-year-old identifying a potential problem. Elias told him he was aware of it. Willie seemed to find this answer satisfactory. Ruth had become his quiet shadow in the woodpile and kindling work. She showed up wherever he was doing small tasks and inserted herself as assistant without asking permission, and he let her, and their conversations were the brief functional exchanges of 2 people who prefer doing things to talking about them. She still carried her wooden spoon. Once Clara saw her prop it against the woodpile while she helped Elias carry logs, and when she was done she picked it back up and carried it inside, and Elias watched this with the expression of a man who had questions and had decided not to ask them. The twins were full converts. They had decided Elias was the most useful person they'd ever encountered, and they followed his lessons with a focus they applied to almost nothing else in life. Not schoolwork, not chores, not anything Clara had ever tried to teach them. She found this mildly offensive, but mostly just relieving. Elias showed James how to set a proper snare, and James showed Samuel, and Samuel improved on James's technique, and then they both argued about whose version was right for approximately 4 days until Elias told them both versions worked, and they should stop. Nora was the one whose relationship with him she watched most carefully, because Nora was the one who'd gotten there first. They talked sometimes in the evenings, after the younger children were in bed, when Clara was at the table doing whatever mending or accounting needed doing, and Elias was in the chair by the fire doing whatever he did in the evenings. Sometimes the battered poetry book, sometimes just sitting. Nora would sit across from him and ask him things. She had an interviewer's instinct, Nora. She didn't pepper people with questions. She asked one and waited and let the answer open the next one naturally. She asked him how long he'd been on the mountain. He told her 11 years. She asked if he'd been alone all that time. He said most of it. She asked why. He looked at the fire for a moment and said that some things took a long time to put away and that he'd needed quiet while he was doing it. Nora said that Henry was like that too, since their father died. Elias said he knew. She asked how he knew. He said he recognized it. Clara listened to this from the table and kept her eyes on her mending. It was the poetry book that opened things between her and Elias. She'd asked about it once, early on, and he'd said a woman used to read it to him and she'd let it go. But one evening, about 6 weeks into their stay, she came in from checking on the horse. She'd taken over that task herself when Elias was recovering and kept it out of habit, and found him reading by the fire, and the book was face up on his knee in a way that let her see the cover for the first time. It was a collection. Various poets, from the spine. Old by the look of it. She sat down across from him without comment. He finished whatever passage he was on and closed it. "Eleanor," she said. He went very still. "You said her name," Clara said. "During the fever. I wasn't going to mention it, but it seemed—" She stopped. Restarted. I'm not asking for details. I just wondered if you wanted to talk about it. Or not. Either is fine. He looked at the fire for a long moment. The silence was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to say anything, and she was about to tell him to forget it when he said, "She was my wife." "What happened to her?" "She died," he said. 8 years ago, childbirth. Clara absorbed this. "The baby." "Also," he said, flat, simple, the word that contained everything. She didn't say she was sorry because she'd had enough people say that to her after Thomas, and she knew how little it covered. She sat with it the way it deserved to be sat with, in silence. After a while he said, "I came up here after. I thought—" He stopped, started again differently. "I thought if I stayed busy enough and stayed away from people enough, eventually it would stop feeling like something that had happened to me and start feeling like something that had happened a long time ago to someone else." "Did it work?" "Partially," he said. "I got good at being alone. I got good at not thinking about it. That's not the same thing as recovering, but it looked enough like it from the outside that I stopped examining the difference." Clara thought about the fire he built every morning before anyone was awake. The old habit, he'd called it. She understood now what the habit was. The muscle memory of a man who'd spent years tending a fire for a woman who wasn't there anymore. "Thomas," she said, offering it the same way he'd offered Eleanor. He wasn't a brilliant farmer. He knew that about himself, and it bothered him, but not enough to change anything. We were behind every year. I knew the numbers. I think he knew I knew, but we didn't talk about it directly." She paused. "I used to think, if we just talked about it plainly, if I just said, 'Thomas, we need to do this differently,' maybe we would have gotten ahead of it. Maybe he'd have taken a different job in the winter, or we'd have cut back, or something would have changed." She smoothed the mending in her lap that didn't need smoothing. "I don't know if that's true, but I still think it." He looked at her. "That's not the same as it being your fault." "I know that intellectually," she said. "And otherwise?" "Otherwise, I'm working on it." He nodded slowly, like he recognized the distinction. 8 years, she said, "and you've been up here alone." "Yes." "Weren't you lonely?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "I didn't let myself be," he said finally. "I kept busy enough. But—" He stopped. "But—" "I noticed it had gotten very quiet," he said. "I hadn't noticed when it happened. And then one day I noticed, and I didn't know what to do about it, so I didn't do anything." He looked at the fire. "And then your wagon came up the trail." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which gave her a moment to see his face without managing her own at the same time. The bearded jaw, the careful eyes. A man who'd built walls at altitude and gotten good at being inside them. "The offer you made," she said, "when you came to the door. You said your mother had 6 children and nobody helped her." "That's true." "Was that the only reason?" He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you at the meeting hall," he said. "I'd come into town 2 days before for supplies, and Cobb told me what Pryor was planning. I went to the meeting to hear for myself." He paused. "You told Pryor that a 3-year-old doesn't understand that spring is coming. She just knows she's alone." His jaw moved slightly. "I knew somebody who understood that. When they were 3. That's not a thing you stop knowing." She understood he was talking about himself, about whatever his childhood had held before the woman with 6 children and not enough to survive the winter. She didn't ask about it. She held it the way he'd held her admission about Thomas, carefully, without pushing. "Thank you," she said, "for what you offered, for what you've done." "You've more than earned your keep," he said, "and more." "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He looked at her then, directly, with those gray-blue eyes. He didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, some wall relocated, and she thought, there is more to this man than he shows, and that's not a warning, it's just a fact. And the more she'd seen of it, the more it made sense to her. She picked up her mending and went back to it, and he opened the poetry book again, and the fire burned between them, and neither of them needed to say anything else that night. February came in hard. 2 weeks of temperatures that kept everyone inside and ran through the woodpile faster than anyone liked. Clara ran the numbers, and they were manageable but not comfortable, and she noticed Elias running the same numbers in the back of his mind and coming to the same conclusion. They didn't discuss it directly. They adjusted. Smaller fires overnight, extra blankets. The children piled together in the back room for warmth in a tangle of arms and quilts that they complained about and then fell immediately asleep in. Henry was outside every day regardless. She stopped telling him it was too cold because he'd look at her with that patient Thomas look and go out anyway, and she understood. He needed the work the way she needed the numbers, needed to have something to do with his hands and his energy, or it turned inward and got dark. Elias started going out with him. She didn't know when this started happening exactly. She looked out one morning, and they were both at the woodpile, working in the particular silence of two people who found a rhythm together, Henry splitting and Elias stacking, or the other way around, trading the work back and forth without discussion. She watched them from the window for a minute. She asked Henry about it that evening. "He's been showing me things," Henry said. He was eating, not looking at her, with the slightly offhand manner he used when something mattered to him more than he wanted to show. How to read weather, how to tell when a tree is going to fall before it falls, what to do if a snare catches something bigger than you expected. He ate for a moment. Useful things. Do you like spending time with him? Henry was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to deflect. Then he said, "He doesn't try to be anything he isn't." She turned that over. "No," she said, "he doesn't." "Papa did that sometimes," Henry said. "Pretended things were fine when they weren't. I think he did it to protect us, but it was... You always knew anyway. It was just a thing you both had to pretend." He ate some more. "Crowe doesn't do that. He just says what's true. Sometimes that's hard to be around." "Sometimes," Henry agreed, "but I know where I stand." She looked at her son and thought, "You are becoming someone I want to know, and I'm losing time with you while it happens because you're 12 and growing up is a thing that happens whether you watch it or not." "You're doing a good job," she said. "All of this, everything you've done since October, you're doing a very good job." Henry looked at his bowl. "I'm doing what's needed." "That's usually the hardest kind of job," she said. He didn't answer, but he finished his dinner. The conversation about Eleanor happened in pieces, not all at once. He told her more as the winter went on, not in single long confessions, but in small installments, the way a man releases things when he's been holding them a long time and has forgotten that releasing them was possible. She didn't push. She listened when he offered and let the silences be what they were when he didn't. She learned that Eleanor had come west from Pennsylvania, that she'd been a school teacher, that she'd been the one who insisted on the poetry and who had slowly infected him with it until he read it himself and could never fully stop. She learned that they'd had 2 years together before she became pregnant, and that those 2 years had been, by his account, brief and sufficient and better than anything he'd known before. She learned that after Eleanor died, he had not grieved in any conventional sense, that he had packed everything and come north and built the cabin and kept moving until there was nothing left to move toward, and then stayed because stopping hurt less than going. That the walls he'd built weren't around his feelings, but around his life. He'd made his life small enough that nothing else could get through and hurt him, and then the smallness had become its own kind of problem that he'd been inside for so long he'd stopped seeing it. She told him things in return, in the same piecemeal way. About Thomas. Not just the debt and the failing farm, but the good parts, the specific things she missed, the way he read to the children on Sunday evenings, the way he laughed at his own jokes before the punchline, which was objectively terrible and which she'd found inexplicably endearing. The way he'd called her name when he came in from the field, just to hear where she was in the house, and how she hadn't understood how much she'd needed to be called for until nobody was calling anymore. One evening she said, "Do you think you'll ever come back down, to town, to people?" He looked at the fire. "I've been thinking about it differently lately," he said. "How so?" "I spent 8 years making my life smaller," he said, "thinking that was the same as making it safer." He paused. "But safety that requires you to get rid of everything worth protecting isn't really safety. It's just emptiness with a better name." She looked at him. 8 years is a long time to figure that out. I'm not quick, he said. You're not slow, she said. You just didn't have anybody to think out loud with. He looked at her then in a way that made her look away first, down at her hands, and she sat with the warmth in her face for a moment, and told herself it was the fire. The thaw started in March. It wasn't a real thaw. The nights were still brutal, and there would be more storms before winter released its grip. But the light changed, the days stretched longer, and on the southern side of the cabin the snow pulled back from the wall and showed a thin strip of frozen earth that wasn't quite ground yet but wasn't quite snow anymore either. Clara stood and looked at it one morning, and she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't immediately name. Spring meant the road back to Raven Creek. Spring meant the conversation Elias had said they'd have. You leave or you don't. That's your choice. Spring meant making a decision she hadn't let herself fully think about because there had always been a more immediate thing to manage. She thought about the cabin in Raven Creek that needed a new roof, the debt to Griggs, Pryor and his arrangements, the hall full of men with their maps. She thought about the cabin on the mountain, too small and too loud and warm, all the way through the worst of winter. She thought about what Henry had said. He doesn't try to be anything he isn't. I know where I stand. She thought about how she felt at the table in the evenings, the particular quality of that quiet that was nothing like the quiet in the cabin after Thomas died. That quiet had been absence. This was, she didn't have the right word, rest maybe, the quiet of people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. She hadn't let herself examine what that meant directly. She'd kept it in her peripheral vision, the way you keep a flame when you're not sure yet if you want to cup your hands around it or let the wind take it. But it was March, and the edge of the south wall was showing through the snow. She went inside and started breakfast and thought about things she hadn't let herself think about yet. Elias asked her about it directly, the way he did most things. He came in from the barn one evening and they were the last two awake, which happened now with regularity, and he sat down and looked at her across the table and said, "Spring's coming." "I know. You'll want to start thinking about the road." "I have been," she said. He nodded. He looked at the table. "I meant what I said at the beginning. You're free to go when the road opens. I'll take you myself if you want. Help you settle back in." She looked at him. "And if I don't want?" He looked up. "And if the children don't want," she said. "And if we've been here long enough that going back sounds less like returning and more like leaving?" She held his gaze. "What then?" He was very still. "I'm not saying that's the case," she said. "I'm asking a question about how you'd feel about it." He was quiet for long enough that she started to think she'd miscalculated, that she'd read the evenings and the fire and the way he built it every morning before anyone was awake as something more than they were. Then he said, "I'd feel like I'd been given something I didn't know how to ask for." She sat with that. "Elias," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name, she realized, though she wasn't sure when she'd started thinking of him that way. "What do you want?" He looked at her with his direct gray-blue eyes and said, with the same plainness he applied to everything, "I want you to stay. I want all of you to stay." A pause. "I know that's not a simple thing. I know what it would mean and what it wouldn't mean yet, and I'm not asking for any of it to be decided tonight." He took a breath. "But you asked what I wanted. That's what I want." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she'd learned over a winter, the steadiness and the walls and the places where the walls had gaps in them that she'd found by accident and kept finding. At the man who slept in a cold barn so her children could have his home, who built the fire every morning before anyone was awake, who'd climbed down a mountain with 3 claw wounds because he'd said he'd be back in 3 days. "I'm not deciding tonight either," she said. "I know. But I hear you." He nodded once. He looked at the fire. She looked at it too, and they sat together in the way they'd learned to sit together, the not-quite silence that was better than most conversations she'd had. And outside the mountain shifted slightly in the March dark, the snow on the south wall loosening its grip by another small degree, and spring came the way it always did on the frontier. Not all at once, but incrementally, one small thaw at a time, each one making the next one possible. Henry had left a lamp burning in the back window. Clara could see its light through the gap in the curtain. Her son, keeping a light on the way she'd kept fires going all winter, the way you do when you've learned that the people you love need to be able to find their way back. She would make a decision. Not tonight, but soon. She already knew what it was going to be. She told him on a Tuesday morning in the third week of March. There was nothing particularly significant about the morning. It was cold still, the ground hard, the sky a pale washed-out blue that meant the weather was holding but not promising. Elias was at the table with his coffee and his accounting of the remaining stores, and Clara came in from checking on the children and stood in the middle of the room and said, "We're staying." He looked up. "The children and I talked about it," she said. "All of them, even Willie. I put it to them as plainly as I could, what it would mean to go back and what it would mean to stay, and I let them say what they actually thought." She paused. "They want to stay." "What do you want?" he said. "I want to stay," she said. "I'm staying." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see something working behind his eyes. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the particular expression of a person who has received something they'd half convinced themselves was not coming and needs a second to absorb it. Then he said, "All right? That's all you have to say?" "What else should I say?" "Most people would say more than all right." "Most people talk to fill silence," he said. "I mean it. All right." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct, and she thought, this is what he looks like when he's pleased. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It looks like everything from where she was standing. "There are things we need to work out," she said, moving to sit across from him. "The cabin needs to be larger. 7 children and 2 adults in this space through another winter is asking too much. The south wall could be extended, add another room or two, maybe a proper sleeping loft. I've been thinking about the layout." She pulled the bark piece Henry used for accounting toward her and turned it over and started sketching with the charcoal stick. "If we run an addition off this wall here, we could have a proper sleeping room for the children and free up the back room for something else. Storage or—" "You've been planning this for a while," he said. She looked up. "I've been thinking about it since February." Something moved in his expression that was almost, not quite, a smile. "Show me the layout," he said. She showed him. He leaned over the bark and looked at it with the focused attention he gave to anything structural, pointing out where the ground was soft on the south side and would need deeper footings, where the roof line would need to change to handle snow load, how they'd need to run the second flue or the new room would be cold all winter. They talked for the better part of an hour, not about feelings, not about what this meant, or how they were going to manage the complications of 2 adults and 7 children, and a future that hadn't fully declared its shape yet, but about the practical and the structural, about load-bearing walls and wood supply, and whether they could get the frame up before the real spring mud made the ground a problem. It was, she thought, exactly the right conversation to have. Telling the children had been its own undertaking. She'd done it the evening before she spoke to Elias, gathered them all in the main room, even May, who was 4 now and could follow more than people gave her credit for. She'd sat them down and been as direct as she could be, the way she'd tried to be with them all winter, because she'd found that children handled hard truths better than comfortable vagueness, that what frightened them wasn't reality, so much as the suspicion that the adults around them were managing the reality out of their sight. She told them the road to Raven Creek would open in a few weeks. She told them they could go back if they wanted, that she'd find a way to make it work, that she wasn't going to pretend the path was easy, but she'd walked hard paths before. And she told them the other option, that they could stay, that she and Elias had talked, that the mountain could be their home if that's what they chose. The twins spoke first, simultaneously, saying yes before she'd finished the sentence, which she'd expected. May said she wanted to stay because she liked the horse, which was May's reason for most decisions. Willie said he didn't want to go back to the cold house, meaning the Raven Creek cabin, which she hadn't realized he'd thought of that way. Ruth sat with her wooden spoon and was quiet for a while and then said, "Mr. Crowe showed me how to split kindling. I don't think they'd let me do that in town." Which was, Claire supposed, a yes. Nora was the one she watched. Nora sat with the question the way she sat with all big things, contained, taking it apart carefully before she said anything about it. She looked at the floor and then at the window and then at her mother. "If we stay," she said, "it's going to be different. It's not going to be like it was with Papa." "No," Clara said. It won't. That's not bad, Nora said. She said it slowly, like she was making sure she meant it as she spoke it. It's just true. Yes, Clara said. It is. Nora looked at the window again. Will we go back to school? We'll figure out schooling, Clara said. There are ways to manage it. I'd want to keep learning, Nora said, even up here. I wouldn't have it any other way. Nora was quiet for another moment. Okay, she said. The same word she'd been saying since November, that word that meant, I am choosing to trust you, not because I have no fear, but because I've decided the trust is worth more than the fear. Henry hadn't said anything. He sat at the end of the group with his arms resting on his knees, and he listened to everyone else, and he didn't speak. Clara looked at him and waited. You've already decided, he said finally. Not accusing, just stating the way Nora stated things. I want to know what you think, she said. I think... He stopped, started over. I think Raven Creek has Griggs and Pryor and a cabin that lets in the cold. And I think up here I know where things are, and I know what I'm doing, and... He stopped again. He looked at his hands. And I think Crowe is a good man. He is, Clara said. Henry looked up. Then we should stay, he said. That's what I think. Henry was the one who told Elias. She didn't plan it that way. She found out about it afterward, when Elias came in from the barn with an expression that was not his usual contained one, and she looked at him and said, What happened? Your son talked to me, he said. About? He said... Elias stopped, which was unusual. He gathered himself. He said he knew his father wasn't coming back, and that wasn't going to change, and that he wasn't looking for anyone to be his father, and he didn't think that's what I was trying to do either. He said he wanted to be straight with me about that. He paused. And then he said he was glad we were staying, and that he thought the place was better than it was when we found it, having people in it. Clara stood very still. He shook my hand, Elias said. He said it like a man reporting something he was still processing. He's 12. He's old for 12, Clara said. Yes, Elias said. He is. He looked at the door for a moment, then at her. I told him I wasn't trying to replace anything. I told him what he did this winter, keeping the place running when I was sick, that it wasn't just useful, that I was glad he was here. What did he say? He said he knew, Elias said, and then he went back to splitting wood. Clara put her hand over her mouth for a second. Then she dropped it and said, He's going to be all right. Yes, Elias said. He is. The first trip back to Raven Creek happened in early April, when the road had dried enough to take a wagon without losing it to the mud. Clara went with Elias and Henry. The younger children stayed at the cabin with Nora in charge, which Nora accepted with the calm authority of someone who'd been doing it effectively for months anyway. Clara left a list and a schedule, and Nora took them and looked them over and said, We'll be fine, with such simple certainty that Clara believed her. The road down the mountain was different in April than it had been in November. The trees were still bare, but the light came through them at a different angle, and there were places where the snow had pulled back from the creek bank and shown the gray-brown of early ground underneath, not alive yet, but getting there. She sat on the wagon seat next to Elias and watched the landscape change, and thought about the woman who'd ridden up this road in November, sitting stiff-backed and frightened on the seat of a stranger's wagon with 7 children in the back and no certainty about anything beyond the refusal to be separated from them. She didn't feel like that woman anymore. She felt like someone who had been through something and come out changed by it, which was not the same as coming out of it untouched. She was not untouched. She missed Thomas still, would probably always miss him in that specific irreducible way you miss people who were woven into the fabric of your ordinary days. She was tired in ways that went deeper than sleep could reach. She was 34 years old, and she'd buried a husband and almost lost her family and survived a mountain winter, and none of that had happened cleanly or without cost. But she was on this wagon heading down this road, and her children were in that cabin on the mountain, and she knew where she was going and had decided she wanted to go there. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, actually quite a lot. Henry rode in the back with his legs hanging off the tailgate, watching the road behind them, the way he'd ridden up in November watching the road ahead. She noticed the reversal and didn't say anything about it. Raven Creek looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she thought when the wagon came around the bend and the town came into view, just how small it was, how finite. She'd lived there for 8 years and thought of it as a real place, a substantial place. And now she looked at it and saw a collection of wooden buildings on a frozen creek and thought, I built it up in my mind because it was all I knew. Harlan Griggs was the first person she needed to see. He was in the store when she walked in, and he looked up with the expression of a man who hadn't expected to see her walking through his door and wasn't sure yet what it meant. He looked past her, checking the wagon through the window, seeing Elias and Henry. Clara, he said. Harlan, she said. I've come about the debt. She had money. Not much, but enough. She'd figured it out over the winter, taking account of the elk hides Elias had stored, their value in trade, what he'd been owed for the commission work he'd never gotten around to, and a small amount of cash she'd kept back from the original sale of Thomas's farm tools. It didn't cover everything she owed Griggs, but it covered enough that the rest could be set against a fair arrangement going forward. She laid it out plainly. He listened. He was a practical man, Harlan Griggs, whatever else he was, and he recognized a real offer when he heard one. You're not coming back, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she said. We're settling on the mountain. I'm here to close accounts and make arrangements. He looked at her for a moment. With Crowe. With Mr. Crowe, yes. He was quiet. She could see him sorting through what he thought about this and deciding how much of it to say. He settled on, He's a hard man to know. Yes, she said. He is. He's worth the effort. Griggs looked at the money on the counter. He picked it up and counted it with the fingers of a man who'd spent 40 years behind a counter and could assess a sum by feel. He set it back down. This covers the main debt, he said. The rest I'll take in trade. Hides, if he's got them. He'll have them, she said. Griggs nodded once. All right, Clara. She settled 2 other accounts, spoke to the woman at the post office about redirecting any correspondence, and walked the length of the town one more time. She walked past the hall where 14 people had decided what to do with her children, and she stood outside it for a moment and looked at the door. It was just a door. It was just a building. The thing that had happened inside it had felt enormous in November, the size of a mountain, the weight of everything she might lose, and now she looked at the door and it was just wood and iron hardware, and the people inside it had been just people, some of them trying to help in the wrong way, and some of them not really trying to help at all, and all of them mistaken about what she was capable of. She'd been mistaken about it herself, if she was honest. That was the part she'd been turning over for months, quietly, in the spaces between the daily work of surviving. In November, she'd been terrified. She'd sat at that table and looked at the numbers and genuinely believed she might not be able to hold her family together. And that fear had been real, and it had not been irrational, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But what the winter had shown her was that the capacity had been there before the proof of it was. She'd been able to do it before she knew she could. And the knowing, the sure, settled, bone-deep knowing that came from having actually done it, that was something nobody could take back from her now. She wondered if that was what it meant to survive something. Not the surviving itself, but the afterward. When you look back and realize the person who came through wasn't someone new, but someone who'd always been there, just untested. She thought about her children and what the winter had given them. The twins who could read snow and set snares. Ruth who split kindling with the calm focus of a craftsman. Willie who had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that new things didn't have to mean threatening things. May who had made her assessment of the world and found it acceptable and moved through it accordingly. Nora who had always been old for her age and was now old for anyone's age, steady and clear-eyed and quietly formidable. Henry, who had been 12 years old and carried an entire household through 3 days of crisis, and shaken Elias Crowe's hand and said he was glad they were staying. They were not unmarked. They'd lost their father and their home and the life they'd known, and those losses were real and would surface at unexpected times for years, she knew that. But they'd also learned something that couldn't be taught in a schoolroom or given to them by the right circumstances. They'd learned what they were made of, and it turned out they were made of something worth knowing. She walked back to the wagon. Elias and Henry were loading the supplies she'd bought against spring. She stood for a moment and looked at them working together. The large bearded man and the boy who was starting to carry himself like the man he was becoming, moving around each other in the easy rhythm of people who'd found their working terms. She thought about what she'd said to Nora in November. I don't know what's going to happen. I believe we'll be all right. Those weren't the same thing, and she'd known they weren't the same thing, and she'd said the second one anyway because it was the truest, honest thing she had to offer. And it had turned out not because the path was easy or the winter was kind or anything was smooth or certain, but because they had not stopped. They had kept going, one day at a time, one fire at a time, and the accumulation of all those small refusals to quit had added up to something that looked, from the outside, like a story with a shape. From the inside, it had looked like a week, and then another week, and then another. That was what nobody told you about surviving hard things. There was no single moment where you became someone who had survived. There were just the continuous small choices. Get up, build the fire, feed the children, keep going, that added up over time to a life. Aldous Pryor found her before she could leave. She'd expected this. She'd actually expected it sooner, had been half watching for him since she arrived, and when she turned from the wagon and saw him crossing the street toward her, she took a breath and waited. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been 4 months. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying something uncomfortable and was hoping the carrier had come to take it back. "Clara," he said. "Aldous." "You look well," he said, and she could tell he meant it, which surprised her a little. "I am well," she said. He stood in front of her with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the wagon, at Elias and Henry, and then back at her. "It's good to see you," he said, and she thought this was also true. And she thought that Pryor was probably not a bad man, just a man who'd had too much confidence in his own understanding of what other people needed. She understood that kind of confidence. She'd had her own version of it, the certainty in November that the only thing standing between her children and disaster was her refusal. She hadn't been wrong exactly, but she'd been incomplete. What she'd needed wasn't just refusal. It was refusal and a stranger's offer and 7 children who turned out to be more capable than anyone had given them credit for, and a man who slept in a cold barn so they could have his home. Nobody survived alone. That was the thing she'd thought she already knew and then actually learned. "We're settling on the mountain," she told Pryor. "I've cleared the accounts at Griggs's store. I wanted you to know we're not coming back to be worried about." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong," he said, "about what you needed, about what you could manage." She nodded. She didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and she respected him enough not to offer empty absolution. But she said, "You did what you thought was right. I did what I thought was right. Mine turned out to be right for us. I don't hold the rest of it." He looked a little relieved, and a little ashamed, and a little impressed, which seemed like a fair combination. "If you ever need anything from town," he said, "supplies or anything." "We'll come down in the seasons," she said. "We're not gone. We're just further away." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more and couldn't find the words, which she recognized as the condition of a man who has been wrong and knows it and doesn't quite know how to carry that gracefully. She'd been in that condition herself. She put out her hand. He shook it, surprised. She walked back to the wagon and climbed up onto the seat, and Elias was already at the reins, and Henry swung up into the back, and they turned the wagon and headed north. Well, she didn't look back at Raven Creek, not out of anger or drama, not because she was making a point. She just didn't feel the need, the pull she'd felt there, the familiarity of known streets and known faces, the way a place holds you even when it's making you miserable, just because you know its shape. That pull had loosened over the winter. You could spend a long time in a place that was safe in the way that small spaces are safe, the way a room with a locked door is safe, contained and familiar and going nowhere. The mountain wasn't safe in that way. The mountain was cold and steep and full of predators and weather that came without warning. But it was big. And there was something about living inside something big that changed your sense of what you were capable of. Changed it not by making you braver exactly, but by giving you evidence. You needed the evidence. You couldn't just decide to believe in yourself and have it stick. You needed to have done something, failed at something, gotten through something, and be able to look back at it and say, that was me. I did that. She had the evidence now. So did her children. So, she thought, did Elias. Though his evidence had come at a different cost and over a much longer time, and the thing he'd had to do wasn't survive a winter, but survive the far harder project of coming back from a loss that had flattened him and staying flat for 8 years because getting up required wanting something again, and wanting something again meant risking losing it again. She understood that logic. She understood how a person could decide that the math didn't work, that wanting cost too much. But the math was wrong. She knew it the way she knew the numbers in Thomas's account book, by sitting with them long enough to see not just what they said, but what they meant. What it meant to make yourself so small that nothing could hurt you was that nothing could reach you either. The protection and the isolation were the same wall, and you couldn't have one without the other. Elias had let them through anyway. Maybe he hadn't fully decided to. Maybe it had happened before he knew it was happening. A woman in a doorway with 7 children and a refusal to be broken. And something in him that recognized it because he'd known something like it before. In a woman who'd read poetry in a cabin not much different from the one he'd built on the ridge. He'd opened the door anyway. That mattered. That took something, even if he hadn't announced it. She looked at his profile on the wagon seat. The jaw, the beard, the eyes watching the road with their particular settled attention. And she thought about what it took to stay broken for 8 years and then open the door anyway. And she thought it was the bravest thing she'd seen, braver than climbing a mountain with claw wounds, braver than walking into a hall full of people who'd decided your fate, because those were the kinds of bravery you could call on when you had no other choice. Opening the door was a choice. He'd made it. She was glad he had. Yeah, the spring came properly in May. The ground softened and then dried, and then the first green showed, tentative, not quite believing in itself yet. But there. May found it first, the way May found everything, crouched down in front of the cabin examining a small burst of green at the base of the south wall with the focused attention of a person discovering something important. She called for everyone to come look, and they came, all 7 children arrayed around a patch of grass the size of a man's hand, treating it with a gravity that Clara found both funny and moving. It was there all winter, Nora said, under the snow. Everything was, James said. Not everything, Samuel said. Most things, James said. Most things that mattered. She didn't know where he got that from. She stored it away. The work of spring was enormous, and she'd known it would be. They started the addition on the south wall in the second week of May, when the ground had dried enough to dig footings. Elias and Henry did the heavy structural work, and the twins were on material hauling with a commitment they never applied to anything less physical, and Nora took over the daily running of the household so Clara could work alongside the men. She was not a natural builder. She knew this and said so, and Elias told her it wasn't about being natural, it was about being precise. And precision was something she had in quantities. He showed her how to check a wall for plumb, how to read a joint for weakness. And she learned it the way she learned everything he taught her, by doing it wrong first, and then doing it right, and then doing it well. It took most of the summer. There were days when things went wrong. A wall that went up crooked and had to come partway down, a roof joint that hadn't been cut right and took 3 attempts to fit, a day in June when a sudden storm came through and undid 2 days of work on the framing. On that day, she sat in the mud in the rain and looked at the damage and felt something that was not quite defeat and not quite fury, but somewhere between them. And Elias sat down next to her in the mud, which surprised her because he was not a man who performed gestures. And he said, "We build it again." "I know," she said. "It's not wasted. You know how to do it now. The second time is faster." "I know that too." "Then why are you sitting in the mud?" "Because sometimes you need a minute," she said. He sat in the mud with her for the minute. Then they got up and started over. That was how it went. Not smoothly, not without setbacks or bad days or moments when one or the other of them said the wrong thing and had to come back to it later and work it out. She had a temper that he had now seen twice and which she was not proud of, and he had a stubbornness that she found infuriating in exact proportion to how often it turned out to be correct. And there were things they disagreed about that they disagreed about more than once. None of it was clean. But here was what she'd learned over the course of a winter and a spring and into the summer of building. The things worth having were not the things that cost nothing. They were the things you'd put something into, that had the shape of your effort in them, that you could look at and know, I did not receive this. I built this. We built this. And whatever comes at it, wind or winter or the ordinary accumulated weight of hard years, it will hold because we put into it the kind of work that holds. The visitors from Raven Creek came in September. She saw the wagon coming up the trail from the window and called to Elias, who looked and identified it as Pryor's rig, and then they stood together on the porch, the extended porch that now ran the length of the cabin's south face, Henry's idea and a good one, and watched it come. There were 3 of them, Pryor, Griggs, and Doc Finch, who climbed down from the wagon with his bag out of habit and stood in the yard looking at the place with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. She walked out to meet them. She watched them look at what was there to see, the expanded cabin with its new addition and its solid roof, the woodpile that was already stacked for winter and ran the length of the north wall, the kitchen garden Nora had put in and tended with a seriousness usually reserved for legal proceedings, the twins demonstrating something to Willie in the side yard that involved a length of rope and a branch and looked inadvisable from a distance. Henry was up on the cabin roof checking the flashing, which he'd become the household authority on, and he looked down at the visitors with his calm, measuring gaze and then went back to his work. Ruth came out of the barn with May behind her, Ruth carrying a small armload of kindling with the proper grip, May helping with the loose pieces in the dedicated way of someone who has been given an important job. She looked at the visitors without particular interest and went past them to the woodpile and added the kindling to it and went back inside. Pryor stood in the yard and looked at all of it. He looked at the cabin and the woodpile and the children and finally at Clara, and she saw on his face the particular expression of a man revising a story he'd been telling himself, replacing something he thought he knew with something that didn't fit neatly into the space where the old thing had been. "Well," he said. "You're welcome to stay for dinner," she said. Doc Finch said yes before Pryor could say anything. She suspected he'd wanted to make this trip for a while. They stayed for dinner, all 3 of them, at the long table that Elias had extended in June to fit 9 people without anyone losing an elbow. The children were themselves, loud, opinionated, arguing about things that didn't matter and occasionally about things that did, May spilling her water and being completely untroubled by it, Willie conducting a whispered negotiation with Samuel over some item of exchange that Clara decided not to investigate. Pryor watched all of it. After dinner, when the children had gone out into the last of the September light, and it was the adults at the table with coffee, Pryor said to Elias, "You've done good work here." "We've done good work," Elias said. He said it matter-of-factly, not correcting so much as clarifying. Pryor looked at him and then at Clara and nodded. "You have," he said. Doc Finch looked at his coffee. "I'm glad we didn't, He stopped, tried again. "I wasn't sure in November. About the meeting. Whether we were doing right." "You weren't," Clara said without heat. "But neither was I entirely in how I thought about what I needed. I thought I needed to manage it alone. I didn't." "What did you need?" Doc Finch asked. He asked it like a man who genuinely wanted to know, for the next time, so he'd have a better answer. She thought about it. "I needed someone to offer a real option, instead of the only one they'd thought of," she said. "I needed to not be managed. She paused. "I needed someone to believe that I knew my children better than they did, and that that knowledge was worth something in the deciding." Doc Finch nodded slowly. Pryor looked at the table. "I'll take that with me," he said. After the visitors left, she and Elias stood on the porch in the September dark. The sky was enormous and clear, the stars the same hard white they'd been that night in November, when she walked home from the meeting hall with Henry and looked north at the mountains and thought, "I need something close enough to a miracle that it doesn't matter." She'd gotten it. Not a miracle. Nothing like a miracle. Nothing clean or given or without cost. What she'd gotten was harder and stranger and better than a miracle. She'd gotten the truth that the people in the life you needed sometimes arrived looking like something else, looking like a stranger's offer, and a too small cabin and a man who slept in a barn, looking like the worst year of your life. She'd gotten the knowledge that her children were built from something strong, that they could break and rebuild, and learn to read snow and set snares and split kindling and carry households and say okay when they meant, I trust you, even though I'm scared. She'd gotten the knowledge that she was built from something strong too, that she could stitch wounds and fight fevers and sit in mud and start over and mean it every time. She'd gotten Elias. That was its own accounting, separate from the rest. Not simple, not without the weight of what he'd carried and what she'd carried and the complicated work of two people learning to let each other in. But she'd gotten him, and she understood now what she had, and she didn't take it lightly. What are you thinking? He said. A lot of things, she said. What are you thinking? That we need to check the east gutter before it freezes, he said. And, he paused, and that I'm glad you came up that road. She looked at him. The beard, the careful eyes, the man who built fires before anyone else was awake and had done it for 8 years for the memory of someone he loved and would probably do it for the rest of his life. And she had decided that she didn't mind, that loving someone didn't mean asking them to put away the people they'd loved before, that there was room in a person for all of it, the old grief and the new life, the ones who were gone and the ones who were here. I'm glad too, she said. They stood there for a while. Inside she could hear the children, the particular nighttime sounds of 7 people getting settled, Nora's voice reading something aloud, the twins arguing at half volume, May's not quite singing, Willie asking a question that nobody answered, and then asking it again. She listened to all of it, and she thought, this is not the life I planned, not the one I thought I wanted, not the one I would have chosen from the outside, looking in, but it was hers, built from the pieces of what she'd survived and what she'd chosen, and the people who'd chosen her back. And there was something that happened when you built your life that way, from survival instead of safety, from necessity and stubbornness and the refusal to let the people you loved be scattered by someone else's decision. Something settled in you that comfort could never give you. You stopped asking whether you were strong enough. You knew. And knowing was a kind of home all by itself, one that no freeze could get into, no town meeting could reorganize, no winter could take down. You carried it with you. It was the only home that worked that way, the only one that moved when you moved and held when everything else failed. Clara Whitmore had come to the mountain with 7 children and no certainty and one absolute refusal. She stood on her porch in September and watched the stars, and she was exactly where she had decided to be. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.